Hello everyone, Brian Weigel here, and today we will be reviewing Chapter 2 in Renfro and Bond's Archaeology Essentials. We'll talk today about what is left in the archaeological record, the evidence. There are two basic categories for archaeological evidence, and both are important for the preservation and ultimately the discovery or recovery of artifacts that help us learn about the human past. So the context of an archaeological site is extremely important, and there are two primary ways that sites can be formed and also destroyed. The first is obviously the cultural formation process, where humans can have a direct impact on the evidence and the archaeological record. Through their direct deposition and creation, the original activities that led to the creation of an archaeological site, but also through the destruction of them as well, such as farming and plowing. Other activities that form and help preserve sites are and organic materials are preserved in the archaeological record, and the raw material that they're made out of play a big role in how well these will be preserved. So factors, we're going to talk today about factors of preservation and some really cool extreme conditions that help foster remarkable and in some ways unusual cases of preserving the past. So some basic categories and terms that we use when we talk about archaeological evidence. There are four presented here. First, obviously, the artifact, which is a human-created item that ends up in the record. So artifacts tend to be movable, they're portable, they're something that people once used, and eventually they may have modified them or reshaped them and were created by humans. Eventually these are discarded and they end up buried in some way, or sometimes on the surface, but recovered as an artifact. Ecofacts may also show up in an archaeological site. These are natural items like rocks that were not shaped or modified, not considered an artifact, but a natural item that could show up in a site. You may hear me use the word feature. These are typically non-portable items. Some examples could be a fire hearth or the remnants of a campfire, although I transport these by bagging them up in bulk samples and shipping them back to the lab, but they tend to just be stains in the soil. Storage pits, which are dug into the ground and may have contents in them. Typically, these are excavated. Most features are destroyed during excavation, but we record them very carefully. Another example could be a structure or the remnants of a structure, say post-molds stains in the soil where there was once a lean-to or a tent, or a more prominent structure like the remains of a house or even a castle or something large like that. Obviously, I use the word site a lot, an archaeological site, the location of an area that contains artifacts, features, and ecofacts. So these operate on different categories of scale. Here on your map, you can see at the top left a picture of, or a map of, the greater European area with an area in North Central Europe highlighted, and archaeologists like to zoom in on the region where sites might be distributed, or you might find groups of sites, and then down to the individual archaeological site level. Site tends to have boundaries. That could be a large site or a very small site. So archaeologists focus excavations on individual sites where they might find a series of structures, if they're lucky, and features within those structures. So this diagram is showing you how we zoom in to smaller and smaller scales. You might investigate a group of sites associated with a small river tributary, and then look even at the local site level where you could find features or features that connect sites like pathways or roads. The context of a site and of the artifacts is very important. The matrix or the soil matrix that encase a site has to do with its deposition. The soil that formed around or on top of artifacts tells us quite a lot about those artifacts. And so that material or its matrix is very important for understanding the context and site formation over time that the archaeologist is looking to unravel or piece together. A very important word, provenience. This is the exact location of an artifact. We tend to measure these on a grid, which allows us to place it in various specificity to an X, Y, and Z graph where we can plot them. The northing, the easting, and the elevation of an artifact. So provenience is very important. When I excavate a site, much of my notes consists of 3 columns of numbers, which are down to the centimeter in many cases, the X, Y, and Z, northing, easting, and elevation of that find. The artifacts association is also part of its context, the spatial relationship of other finds that are around it or adjacent associated with it. So you could have a remnants of a campfire that have a scatter of bones and artifacts or stone tools around it, and those are all associated with a specific event that occurred at that particular site. If you have an artifact that has no context, somebody picked it up off the ground and brought it in and didn't record its location, may know its region or general vicinity, but you lose all context. There's no matrix, there's no provenience, and there's no association with other artifacts. So the value, the intellectual value of that find is very small or reduced significantly because you've lost all of its context. So we're talking today about site formation processes, and very important term for that is taphonomy, or the study of what happens to an artifact after it's been discarded. So it may be the case that you find some bones in Olduvai Gorge that were originally scavenged by a group of hominids, and then later that carcass was devoured by hyenas and then vultures, which scattered the bones around a river valley or along a lake shore. So these are all things that happened during the course of the formation of those activities that moved the artifacts around and resulted in its ultimate burial. So here is a famous sketch of the taphonomy of a giant panda bear found in China, where it had fallen down into a pit and was began to decay, and eventually some rainwater washed it down further into the crevasse, and its bones were deposited there and ultimately buried. One of the best areas for preservation is a lacustrine environment or along a shallow lake where there wouldn't be a tremendous amount of wave action, but a skeleton or remains could be on the lake shore. Many animals and hominids have died along the shores of lakes and become buried by the gentle deposition of lacustrine sediment. So the gradual piling up of fine silts, which can bury over time a organism in such a way that it doesn't move around a lot after it's been originally deposited. One way archaeologists like to interpret artifacts is by experimenting or experimental archaeology. This would be controlled experiments in the modern era where the archaeologist attempts to replicate the behavior of past people to best understand the artifacts and their function. This is very common in stone tool replication, but there are many other aspects of experimental archaeology that help to interpret the behaviors of the past. use-where analyses on modern implements, so recreating a stone tool and then using it to scrape a hide in the modern times can help you determine what you might observe on those artifacts that were deposited thousands of years ago. Other forms of experimental archaeology, the Overton Down project, where archaeologists created a ditch and bank system that replicated one from the medieval period, and they buried artifacts in there and tried to simulate the conditions of the site that they were looking at. So they created a time capsule, and this was originally done in the 1960s, and then they went back every few years to do controlled excavations. So experimental archaeology could be seen as a control sample in the scientific method that archaeologists often turn to when trying to interpret the past. It could help reduce the researcher's bias in interpreting archaeological evidence. So we have our two important cultural formation, or our two important archaeological formation processes: cultural, which is the deliberate and accidental effects of human activity, and natural, or events not caused by humans that bury, preserve, and destroy sites. One of the greatest threats to archaeological resources around the world is agriculture, the plowing of agricultural fields, the manipulation of the land by creating terraces. Because it alters large tracts of land, it destroys or disturbs many archaeological sites. So looking closer at the cultural formation process, almost every artifact goes through 4 different stages. The acquisition of the raw material, whether that's stone or ivory or wood, that is used to create the artifact, is mined or collected, or it's hunted. And then you have the manufacturing or the production process of the artifact, where it's shaped and created, manipulated, and formed. That artifact is then used. It may get broken and resharpened and used again. It may get converted into a different type of tool, say from a projectile spear point to being used as a knife. And then when its use life is over, it is discarded and disposed of somewhere on the landscape. It may be lost or intentionally thrown away, but then it becomes deposited into the archaeological record. After it's deposited, it may be buried through windblown silt or a lacustrine depositional environment. And the site then begins to be formed. So natural formation processes may take over that. So the material type of the artifact is important. If it's an inorganic artifact, it was not a living item, it cannot be radiocarbon dated. There may be other ways to date it, but stone or metal, fired clay, which is natural soils, clay soils that are fired into ceramics. These preserve very well, but they don't contain organic materials. So the decay process is different and more durable than, say, an organic item that is from a living organism, wood or plant material, ivory and bone. These are all organic items. Human remains, we are organic organisms, obviously. So the preservation of organic remains depends on the site matrix or its depositional environment. So climate is a factor. Specific natural disasters may influence that, and the site formation around it. So here you see me excavating a mammoth tusk at the Holtzman site in interior Alaska, which was deeply buried in windblown silts, very rich in calcium carbonate. So it's relatively dry and well drained and encased in 1.5 or more meters of calcium-rich silts, and this helped preserve the fauna very well in that kind of a depositional environment. So a few key concepts that I've just discussed here: the survival of organic materials, preservation, matrix, the climate, natural disasters, all play factors in the preservation of many important archaeological sites. So we'll talk a bit about different environments and climates and their effects on preserving archaeological materials. Of course, one of the most famous archaeological discoveries was King Tut's tomb. King Tut ruled in ancient Egypt between 1332 and 1323 BC. So he wasn't a relatively powerful or long-reigning pharaoh. He died quite young, and his burial was hastily put together in a tomb that probably wasn't prepared for him. They weren't ready for him to die. But the importance of the discovery by Howard Carter was that this tomb had been sealed and untouched or unspoiled by looters since the time of his burial. There's a number of reasons for that. He wasn't a well-known pharaoh, so people weren't specifically looking or seeking out his tomb. And as they raided other tombs of more well-known pharaohs like Ramses II in the Valley of the Kings, some of that debris may have been pushed over onto the threshold or the opening to the tomb for King Tut, and it was buried accidentally before raiders got in and took all of the goods. So it represents a very important snapshot in the history of ancient Egypt because it was so well preserved. And as we know, Egypt is a very dry desert climate. On top of that, the finds were sealed inside very well constructed stone tombs, so it preserved very well organic items that were stored inside. So it was dried and sealed, and as a resort you have wood and other organic materials that would otherwise rot away that were pristine in their discovery. Very well preserved. Other important discoveries around the world in Siberia: extreme preservation conditions. Freezing obviously is an excellent way to preserve organic artifacts. I want to talk a little bit about the frozen tombs of chiefdoms in Pazyrık, Russia, where we see human tombs with all of their goods placed in them and buried in the ground in Siberia in permafrost. So they're like deep freeze, deep chest freeze containers holding the burials of important elites. We know quite a bit about these people who are related to the Scythian groups, tribal pastoralists from the plains of Russia, lived during the Iron Age, approximately 500 to 300 BC. And there are written accounts by the Greek historian Herodotus who describe the lives of the Scythians and similar types of people that lived to the north and to the east of the ancient Greeks. So while the Scythians did not make a written account, we have outside observations of them. But more importantly, we have very well preserved material culture. So near perfect textile preservation, very well preserved human remains, and extraordinary archaeological discoveries from the frozen tombs of Siberia. So we know that the Scythians were excellent artists, and their tombs were, whether intentional or not, very well designed for preservation. Digging down into the permafrost, which is not easily done, and lining them with logs. They buried people with their horses and a lot of goods that they would need in the afterlife and covered them up in tombs. We have remarkable felt rugs that are dyed really extravagant artistic expression. They were remarkable artists and goldsmiths, and the material record of that culture is enhanced by the environment in which they lived. Scythians had elaborate tattoos that depicted a lot of the importance and ideological aspects of their lives, talking about horseback tribal warriors, the likes of which are rarely seen, could be equated or compared with the Comanche of the Great Plains, where a very elaborate, ritualistic, warrioristic, pastoral society emerged around horseback riding. Elaborate art, and the earliest known use of, or one of the earliest known use of cannabis. We have material evidence that, say, people self-medicated with cannabis. In some instances, a princess that potentially was afflicted with breast cancer appears to have used cannabis as a medication. And so the use of the medicinal properties of marijuana early in the prehistory of Siberia. Scythians were suburb mounted horsemen, and that's reflected in their iconography and their artistic style. They hunted and were a pastoralist group, very elaborate, socially ranked society with intricate artifacts. The Gold Room in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, is one of the great experiences in museums that I've ever encountered. Very intricate, well done artistic gold craftsmanship associated with these groups. Other extreme preservation conditions, cold and wet. We'll talk a bit about Ötzi the Iceman a few times in this series. The Iceman died about 3,300 BC and was originally discovered by hikers in the Alps near the Austrian and Italian border, where a body was found in an ice patch eroding out, and the hikers thought it was a recent hiker and called the police department. The police quickly realized that this was a very old hiker dating back to the Bronze Age. Ötzi was frozen in the ice. We know from his stomach contents that he ate coarse grain, cereals, and internal organs were still intact. He had ibex or venison meat in his intestines, ate wheat, plums, and other plants as well. We know that he carried with him quite a lot of items. Probably the more remarkable aspect of this discovery is all the things he had with him. Organic preservation was extremely high in this area. Ötzi has contributed significantly to our understanding of the early Bronze Age in Europe. He had a copper axe hundreds of years before we believe that copper axes made an appearance. His clothing was well preserved. We even have recovered his shoes. He had a very sophisticated frame-lined backpack, sewn birch bark containers with evidence of fire starting material, cape woven grass, reeds for an external coat, a bearskin cap, and his undergarments, all very well preserved. In South America, cold and dry preservation at high altitudes has led to several other remarkable discoveries of excellent preservation. Inca human sacrifices dating to 1500 to 1600 AD in the Andean highlands. Many of these have been discovered by the National Geographic fellow Johann Reinhardt, who you see here with some amazing discoveries at high elevation where there's very little oxygen up there. They're essentially freeze dried because There's not a lot of precipitation, and what there is in the form of frozen water, and so the preservation is remarkable. One of the most elaborate discoveries is the Ice Maiden from Uyuyako mountain. Uyuyako girl is freeze-dried, and she is pristine. You can see the braids in her hair. It's as if she's just sleeping. She's about 16 years of age and was sacrificed to the gods. The textiles are remarkably preserved. Dating to the Inca Empire, we know they practiced human sacrifice, and they believed that the gods lived high in the mountains. She was found at 20,708 feet, which is one of the highest points in the Western Hemisphere. Over 100 ceremonial centers have been located at various elevations around South America, and they contribute our knowledge to the material culture of the Inca because of the excellent preservation that exists in these environments. So these were not buried in any way. They were just sitting on top of these mountains in the position that they were left 500 years ago. In the far north, recent discovery in the Yukon Territory of this wolf puppy, which is 50,000 years old. It represents some of the oldest known soft tissue and hair ever discovered. It was found by miners in 2016 and was recovered from the permafrost from a very deep freeze. Excellent preservation of this wolf puppy. Back over in Europe, wet and waterlogged, so not frozen, but saturated in water for long periods of time, is also an excellent way to preserve organic material. Here you see the torso. He's missing his head and from his belly below, but his arms and torso are preserved of the old Krogon man from peat bogs in Northern Europe. We know that old Krogon man ate wheat and buttermilk as his last meal and died sometime between 362 and 175 BC, so well more than 2,000 years old, but the preservation of his carcass is remarkable. It looks like dried leather. You would think that something that was wet would not preserve very well, but in the peat bogs, where you have an anaerobic environment where oxygen is not prevalent in the depths of the peat bog, it preserves organics extremely well. So these are Iron Age bog bodies. They were also ritually killed and are common across Northern Europe. You can learn more about bog bodies through the ArchaeoSoup link provided here. One of the most remarkable things I've ever seen is Talund Man, who's on display in Denmark at the Aarhus Museum. Talund Man dates to 375 to 210 BC, and the skin and organics are turned this dark gray color by the tannic acids present in the bogs. So not only is it waterlogged, but it's very acidic down there. And you would think that moisture and acid would decompose organics, but in the absence of oxygen or an anaerobic environment, it preserves organics extremely well. So Talund Man was ritually killed at least 3 times. We'll talk more about Talund Man and Utsi the Iceman in subsequent videos. But it's that acidic and anaerobic waterlogged bog environment that preserves these organics extremely well. I thank everybody for their attention, and these are the credits for the images that I've used in this video, and I wish you all very well, and thank you for sharing the remarkable preservation factors that exist in archaeology.